I've spent most of my reporting career focused on older people, older kids, high school, post high school, older adults. But like 4 years ago or so, I got really interested in how children learn to read, specifically because I met some people in college who were struggling and told me they had dyslexia, and I didn't know anything about dyslexia. So it started this reporting project on why it's so hard for many kids with dyslexia to get the help that they need in school. And what I came to understand is that a really big part of the problem is that kids across the country, as you mentioned, Suzanne, are not being taught how to read. Reading instruction in lots of schools is based on an assumption about reading that turns out not to be true. And the assumption is that learning to read basically is a developmental process that will happen in time as long as kids have some guidance from a teacher and access to lots of books and motivation to read them. And the assumption is that if kids don't do well under those conditions, either someone didn't read to them enough when they were little kids, or they have a reading disability. And this turns out not to be the case. For the most part, when kids are struggling with reading, it's because no one taught them how to do it. Because learning to read, as it turns out, is not like learning to talk. And that's sort of one of the assumptions that undergirds a lot of reading instruction in this country, is that learning to read and learning to talk are similar processes. But many, many, many researchers over the past several decades and more have figured out that that's not the case. It doesn't happen naturally. We're not born with brains that are wired to read. Kids need to be explicitly taught how to do it. Some kids need very little instruction. They practically teach themselves how to read. But a lot of kids need a lot of instruction. And kids with dyslexia, for example, need a lot of instruction. They're kind of the first casualties, the biggest casualties when schools don't teach kids how to read. They're kind of like canaries in the coal mine. But what ends up happening is the kids who aren't learning to read in school need outside help, because a lot of times they're not getting what they need in school. And what happens is, how do they get that outside help? Well, in a lot of cases, the kids who get help get it because their family can pay for it. They can pay for private testing, they can pay for tutors, they can pay, in some cases, for very expensive private schools. One mom told me that getting help for a struggling reader is a rich man's game. And so I've been on this topic for several years because I've really just been bothered by the question, what about everyone else? And not that those kids parents are paying lots of money for them to get help should be in that situation either. It's a horrible situation for them. It's very expensive. It can be very damaging. But if you have money and resources, at the end of the day, you can probably figure out a way for your kid to be taught how to read. But again, what about everyone else? So that's really what led to this most recent podcast episode, What the Words Say. It's really about the consequences when schools don't teach kids how to read, because it's not just kids with dyslexia who are left behind. Most kids need a pretty good dose of explicit instruction, and when schools don't provide that, they're leaving a majority of the kids behind, it turns out. Most of us really need to be taught how to read. Some of those kids are going to get the help, but if you're from a moderate income family, a low income family, really, or even a moderate income family, you're not being taught to read in school, what do you do? And the equity implications of this are stunning. This ends up reproducing and creating inequality all over the place. And that's what this episode is about.